Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Rowley, and I'm the Outreach Librarian at the NOAA Central Library. And I'm very happy to welcome you to another installment of our Publishing at NOAA series. This one entitled Sherpa Romeo, Wherefore Art Thou Copyright Permissions, which is being led by our librarian in College Park, Jan Thomas. I will be taking questions, or we will be taking questions. You can put them into the question or chat panel throughout the presentation, but we'll answer them on the back end after the slides. This is being recorded, and if you are having any technical difficulties using GoToWebinar, my advice is to try logging off and logging back in. That usually solves the problem. You might have to do it more than once. But if you do have to hop off for technical reasons, this will be posted up on the library's YouTube channel after the fact, so you can revisit it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan.
Hello, thank you, Katie. As she mentioned, my name is Jan Thomas. I'm the librarian at the NOAA Center for Weather and Climate Prediction in College Park. And today I'm going to talk you through using Sherpa Romeo and the instances that where you may find it useful in your dealings with copyright permissions. So just a little background information before we launch into Sherpa Romeo. I want to talk a little bit about the institutional repository, which I work on as a librarian. So that's the reason that we utilize that tool. In 2016, the Obama administration issued the OSTP memo asking government agencies that spend more than $100 million on research to make that research available to the public who funded it. And in order to address this, this memo, NOAA enacted the Plan for Increasing Public Access to Research Results, also referred to as the PAR plan. And one of the major components of the PAR plan was tasking the library for coming up with a digital space that we could collect and disseminate the materials that were authored and funded by NOAA. And so that's how the institutional repository was launched. So the IR collects several different types of submissions. If you've submitted to the IR, this might be redundant to you, but it collects NOAA funded and authored works by having organizations, publication managers, and authors themselves submit them. And then there's a team of librarians that go through the submissions and eventually ingest them and make them available to the public. But typically, the type of publications we get are either internally published NOAA documents, such as technical memorandum, technical reports, data reports. Government produced works are copyright free and able to be used by the public without restriction. So that's we're not interested in the Sherpa Romeo for those instances. The tricky part is when we start talking about NOAA authored and funded articles that have been accepted and published in academic journals. So while government produced works are still copyright free, there's a number of issues with these articles that sort of muddy the waters in terms of copyright privileges. Collaboration with non-government authors, cooperative institutes, contract staff versus federal employees. And then there's an instance where the publisher's formatting adds unique value and sometimes is even protected by intellectual property itself. So redistributing that is an infringement. So that's just to say there are a lot of complexities surrounding copyright issues. In the repository, typically we use one of two different types of versions of articles, and you'll see these terms pop up a lot during the course of this presentation. The published version, or the version of record, we can do that. We can use the published version with open access journals, and we can also use it with permission from the publisher based on those rights. And then there's the accepted version, which is after the peer review edits have been taken place, but before the publisher's formatting. It's sometimes referred to as a manuscript version, but for for this presentation and in terms of Sherpa Romeo, the terminology that they use is the accepted version. So that's how we're going to refer to that. So if you're interested in having and in specific copyright questions answered about what rights you have as an author, I will point you to these specific resources. CENDI, which stands for Commerce, Energy, NASA, and Defense Information Group Managers. They have a number of different documents talking about copyright and intellectual property as it pertains to different government agencies. We also at the library have compiled a publishing and scholarly communication guide. So that will give you different information about aspects of copyright, publishing, open access, the institutional repositories, and a bunch of other matters. But because of the complexity of intellectual property law regarding copyright and how it pertains to government work, the purpose of this specific talk isn't to really answer those questions. It's to talk about how you can use the tool of Sherpa Romeo to discover those the copyright permissions and policies. So I would encourage you, if you have a specific question about copyright in regards to your own work, the best place to have it answered is with NOAA's General Counsel. And if you don't know how to get in touch with someone there, please email me or the institutional repository at the library, and we can put you in contact with someone who can better answer a question that might have legal ramifications. So now for the reason that we're here, the crux of the talk is the tool Sherpa Romeo. So it's a website that's devoted to aggregating publisher and journal open access policies. The last version of it was very easy to use, but it was revamped because it was basically overly simplistic. It was based around a color coding scheme where journals would fall into red, yellow, or green versions. And they would generally supposed to tell you what it was that you could do with them based on that color scheme. But these policies, the copyright policies from the publishers, don't really fit neatly into 3 different groupings. And so they had a lot of explanatory text, and in some instances that was longer than the talk of the permissions. So it's revamped. The color coding scheme has been retired, and the new design and codification represents the complexity of the copyright landscape by showing the relationship between particular pathways to publication and what the redistribution may be. Sorry. So specifically, we at the institutional repository will use Sherpa Romeo to determine which version of publication we can accept from authors. When you submit a journal article to the repository, we'll look up that journal in Sherpa Romeo and see if we can use the published version or the accepted version. And often with that, it comes with an embargo period of time. It depends on the publisher, but certain publishers have an embargo, meaning they have a specific length of time that they have exclusivity on posting and distribution before it's able to be accessed in other places, such as institutional repositories or the author's websites or preprint repositories, whatever the case may be. Not every publisher has an embargo, but they generally, if they do, they generally span between 6 and 36 months, depending on the publisher's policy. So the IR team will use that information to then request the version of the document that is specified in those policies. So the important takeaway from that is that despite, even if you're not first author on a paper, it's important to have, if you're an author or if you're a publication manager, have the authors save manuscripts, save those post peer review pre-formatted versions of these articles so that they can be made available in the repository when the time comes, if that's specified by the publisher. The authors can use Sherpa Romeo for a number of different reasons for the same sort of information. If you have a ResearchGate page or a professional homepage that you want to include copies of the articles, it can tell you your rights on that and what version you can post. And then there is, they can use it when deciding on where to publish. If you wanted to look up the rights beforehand, you can determine whether or not to use green open access instead of paying for gold open access. Oftentimes with hybrid open access journals, they'll charge you additionally to make an item open access and freely available on the publisher's website. But if the publisher allows you to use an accepted manuscript in an institutional repository, you can choose to forego those, paying those open access fees and making it green open access, and which can save thousands of dollars. And if you multiply that by all the authors in NOAA, it could save, millions. Specifically, it's your job to make sure that the institutional repository and the manuscript are not star-crossed lovers. That was my obligatory Romeo and Juliet reference. So I use these terms gold and green open access. I want to explain them a little bit more in depth at this point because they might not be familiar to everyone. So when you hear the term open access, typically what you're thinking of is a gold open access, basically that the journal or the article is free and available to the public, so that when you go to the publisher's website, you can access the work freely. There's no paywall. Gold open access. Green open access references the ability of authors to use the institutional repository to host their material without breaking the terms of the copyright agreement with the publisher. So while it's not free on the specific publisher's site, if someone is searching for your article or the article and they're looking on the repositories page, they could find either the published or the accepted version of it and be able to access the same information that they would without having to pay the $30 or whatever the case may be. And in addition to that, the NOAA IR increases the visibility of the items in our repository by making sure that Google can crawl the IR. So if you just did a search for the title of something, perhaps the first link that you would get in Google would be a link to the publisher's page, but maybe the second or third link that you'd get would be to the repositories page, where it would have it would be representative of being free for people. But we also make sure that the repository is crawled by Unpaywall, which is a browser extension which allows people to access open source versions of articles on pages that might typically represent a paywall. So back to Sherpa Romeo. This is version 1. So this is the older version of the site and not representative of what we have now. So you can see the color scheme right here, the Romeo Green journal. There is brief metadata here at the top, but then it gets into conditions, and it's trying to explain the nuance of how the publisher can provide privileges to the authors, and the version you're able to use. The new layout looks like this. This is the same journal as was represented in the previous slide. The metadata for the journal is all represented up front: title, ISSN, URL, the publisher, and the part that's interesting to us is the publisher's policy, as we're using this tool to outline the different scenarios that can be present at publishing and how you can proceed. And you can see this is broken down into different versions. The versions of the publication. So you have the published version, which we talked about before, the published, the version of record, and then the accepted version, which is that post peer review, pre-formatted version. And within that, there's different pathways. And there are a lot of symbols in the new Sherpa Romeo. So I wanted to take a little time to talk about those and what they mean. I'm not going to get too in depth in it. Some of them are self-explanatory and some of them are actually explained when you open up the specific policy and pathway, which we're going to see in a bit. But some of the more pertinent ones are open access publishing. That's the pathway that includes the open access publishing. Additional open access fee. So some pathways are referencing if you have paid that open access fee on a hybrid open access journal, what your privileges are in terms of the copyright from the publisher. Not permitted, and that's if no open access pathway exists for an article or for that version of an article. Who maintains the copyright? The conditions, that's generally an important one that'll be present on almost all pathways, are the conditions, what needs to happen for you to be able to use that. Those are represented there. Prerequisites are the requirements that must be met to allow that pathway to be used. So if you don't meet those, then that pathway isn't the one that you're looking for. It's not pertinent to your specific instance. Location is the other important one because I typically use Sherpa Romeo for the repository. The important thing to me is to find something that's referencing the location of an institutional repository. But it can be other things like other places like the author's websites or preprint servers, and again, our example will go over a little bit about that. And publisher's deposit references, sometimes a publisher will deposit an article in a place on the behalf of an author, so notably like PubMed Central or something like that. And the embargo is the other very important one in terms of the repository. So unless otherwise stated, the embargo starts on the date of the publication, and it is the amount of time that we have to wait before posting that version of the article in the repository. So for our example, we're going to look at weather and forecasting. It is an AMS journal, and they typically have a pretty favorable policy in terms of publisher. So again, we're looking at the the page for weather and forecasting, you can find that just by within the Sherpa Romeo website. You can find that by searching by ISSN. You can search by the title, or you can just browse alphabetically through the list of journal titles, but it's sizable. So usually the search will bring it up pretty readily. So again, there are a number of different pathways associated with the published version. There's pathway A, B, and C, and we're going to take a look at all of them. But in order to find out more information, because these symbols don't really tell us the whole story, we're going to access this little plus sign on the right-hand side of the page to find out more information about pathway A. So pathway A, clicking on that plus sign opens up and gives us this additional information. It still has the symbols used at the top, but now it's going to explain specifically what goes into each of those. So in this specific instance, the funders that are named here in this example can use the published version, because again, we're looking at a published version pathway. After an embargo of 12 months. The copyright is still maintained by the publishers, but after 12 months, each of these prerequisite funders will be able to use the published version in the location, the funder's designated location. So each one of them might have a different designated location. That's something you'd probably know if you were working with these funders, but for us in the repository, this pathway wouldn't be pertinent to what we're doing. So while you can see that information, it's not applicable to us. And but the conditions set forth to have that published version available on one of those funder designated locations, the copyright must be acknowledged with a set statement, and you must provide a link to the published article, which is pretty standard in terms of replicating that, posting that in other instances. So this one looks more like something that if I'm looking for the repository, it says institutional repository there is the location. So that's something that we're going to be interested in and will likely pertain to the information that I'm looking for. So pathway B, it's again specifying the published version. So the version of record from the publisher with all the formatting that they have on their own site. So again, here we open up that plus sign on the right-hand side, and we're greeted with some additional information. So the embargo for us is only 6 months. So when the institutional repository wants to post it, we can use the published version, and it will only take 6 months after that publication date to be able to post that in the repository. So again, the same conditions, the copyright must be acknowledged by the with the set statement, and you must link to the published article with the DOI or whatever the case may be. Specific, and then the notes are that the author must be affiliated with the institution. So for our repository, the affiliation would come from either being funded by NOAA or being a NOAA author. Affiliation is extends to contractors as well. So, and then there are 3 additional pathways that talk about the different versions. Again, the 3rd pathway is the published version. Then there's one for the accepted version, which is again before the publisher's formatting, after the peer review, and then the submitted version, which is the version without any peer review taking place at all. It's the initial manuscript that was sent off to the publisher beforehand. So if we take a look at each of those, what they're talking about in this specific one is you see the OA fee. So this is a hybrid open access journal, meaning you can pay to make your journal article freely available to the public on the publisher's website. So this is what it's talking about. It's using the published version. If you pay this OA fee, then it will make it available on the journal's website. The copyright is still with the publisher and there's no embargo. So basically, like, you're paying that fee and then it's going to be available from the moment of publication and free to be used by the general public without any embargo. This publisher, AMS, doesn't want you to use an accepted version. So not permitted generally. They don't want manuscript versions floating around. The submitted version, however, you can use in preprint repositories and on the author's homepage. And again, those conditions are still in effect. But for the author, if you want to have that ready to go, if you're okay with that version of it before the peer reviews being free for people to download, you can post it on your homepage, and AMS permits that without an embargo. You don't have to wait. But again, they still own the copyright on it. Let's see. So utilizing Sherpa Romeo, it's important to note that Sherpa Romeo aggregates this information, but it's updated by the publisher in some instances and the community in other instances. So in terms of best practice, it's always good to check with the publisher site itself, in addition to Sherpa Romeo, to make sure that the information that you're finding there is correct and up to date. Sherpa Romeo almost always links to the publisher's policy unless that is also out of date at the bottom of each entry. So it's generally pretty easy to confirm whether or not those policies are up to date. As open access becomes more prevalent, authors have to weigh in where they're published. And again, APC costs can be very high. I don't know if you guys saw, but Nature just announced like a pilot program offering open access for a payment of like $11,000. So researching these policies and how they can be utilized ahead of time will help and allow for avoiding costs like that when you know that your articles can be reproduced and save you, in some instances you, but in some instances the government or whatever your funding organization is, a lot of money. So when submitting something to the IR, the librarians will then make a determination whether or not we can use the published copy of something or an accepted copy of the article based on Sherpa Romeo, and then again, confirming on the publisher's site themselves. There are some publishers that we know that have very favorable policies towards institutional repositories. AMS and AGU both allow NOAA's institutional repository to use versions of record within 6 months, after a 6-month embargo. So we can use, you don't have to worry about maintaining a manuscript at all if you're publishing in those. And it's something to be considered and weighed when you're peddling your paper. But the burden, it is a requirement to send journal articles to the NOAA institutional repository within 1 year of their publication date. So if you are publishing to a journal that only allows for an accepted version or a manuscript to be used in a repository, it's important that you know that, and often inform yourself before you get to that point of having to submit, so that you make sure that you know that you're going to need that manuscript. Because basically what will happen is, if you submit something and it's the wrong version, someone at the repository will reach out to you and ask that you send a manuscript. And if you don't have it, then you're not going to be able to have your journal article represented in the repository. So knowing ahead of time can safeguard that submission. And as I mentioned before, the browser extensions like Unpaywall will crawl the IR, so it also increases the visibility of and the accessibility of the document in a broader research landscape. So having it is important. So I did want to touch a little bit on Sherpa Juliet, which is we don't use it in the institutional repository, but it's worth noting. So whereas Romeo will search for the publisher's copyright policies, Juliet searches for the funder's requirements. And so it's like Sherpa Romeo, only for funders instead of publishers. So Sherpa Juliet is searchable. It has a single focal point of up-to-date information concerning research funders' policies and the requirements of open access, publication, and data archiving. So some things that you should know. It's super interesting to be able to go and you can browse each of the funders, and you can sort them by country of origin, and these products, Sherpa Romeo and Sherpa Juliet, are UK based, and it's very it's easy to tell. It's more easy to tell in Sherpa Juliet because it's the country of origin skews to the Europe much more than does North America, and it doesn't have anywhere near the number of funding groups that Sherpa Romeo has of journals, but it's interesting to make you aware of it. Oftentimes, NOAA authors will collaborate with other researchers from academic institutions and internationally. So if you are receiving funding from some of these diverse sources, then consulting Sherpa Juliet could indicate to you some of the open access policies of the funders, and make sure that you're meeting their requirements. And I recognize that I went through that very fast, but that is going to leave plenty of time for, I'm sure, an abundance of questions. If you have any questions about Sherpa Romeo or the repository or anything, this is my contact information. I also staff the repository page, so if you've ever interacted there, you know that you can reach out there, and I will be in touch shortly as well there as well.
Thanks, Jan. We do have one question that came in a little bit ago. NOAA affiliation, does this extend to our various university affiliated authors?
When pertaining to what? Like,
Good question. This came in about 10 minutes ago, so I believe it was when you were talking about this.
So I generally say that affiliation, yes, we're going to. I think it really depends on what they're referencing, but NOAA, when we collaborate with cooperative institutes, they're funded by NOAA. So their affiliation with NOAA is financial, and the IR collects any NOAA authored and NOAA funded journal articles. So in that regard, affiliation pertains to anywhere NOAA money touches as well. So those affiliated in that instance should be submitting to the repository. I don't know if that's exactly what the question was in reference to, though.
Thanks, Jan. I think so. I think what they were talking about was what the IR considered an affiliation for submission. And I think you explained it perfectly. Wherever the money is going, that's where we're affiliated.
Right.
Great. Okay, that was the only question we have right now, but I'm giving everyone 30 seconds to think of another one and start typing. Okay, I am not seeing any questions. There is definitely a thanks for doing this talk, Jan, from
Sure.
one of our attendees. But as I said, this is recorded. If you want to rewatch this because you didn't really get the gold versus green and you need to rewatch, we recorded this. It'll be up on the YouTube channel shortly. But if no one has any questions, we do have a question about slides. Jan, will you be making these slides available?
Sure. I can send Katie. Should I share them with you and then you send them out, or you can
Yeah.
contact me directly and I can send them to you. I don't know if
Okay.
you if yeah.
That might work out best. So if anyone on the line right now would like to get a copy of Jan's slides, please email him. Jan, you want to go back to your last slide with your information?
Sure, of course. Yep, there we go. And additionally, yeah, if you want to just email me, I'm happy to share the slides. If you want, I'm also available. I'm happy to do a video call if you have specific questions about copyright or how we're using it in the repository, or how you can use it to learn a bit more, if you're an author or if you're a publication manager, you know, anything to help, I'm happy to do.
Jan, we did have one last question come in. The information in Romeo is only about open access routes. If we choose not to do open access, is that a problem for the IR?
No. I mean, so it isn't only about open access routes. It's about copyright permissions and the permissions of the author and redistribution. So you could see specifically in our example here, this pathway B, it doesn't indicate open access at all. It's just the published version. So basically this article that you've published in Weather and Forecasting, even if it's not open access, we're at the institutional repository because it's mentioned here. We'd be able to use the published version after a 6-month embargo in the repository. So it doesn't require, I mean, so in that, I guess in that instance, it's green open access because we're making it available free of charge in a location that is not the journal's website. But in strictly speaking, like in terms of gold access or hybrid open access, it's not open access in that regard. Does that make sense? So Romeo talks about instances where something is open access, but also there are other pathways that of where it can be used if the publisher allows without having those be open access.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Jen. I hope we answered Brian's question. From my understanding, Romeo is telling you how your paper can be spread among institutional repositories or shared in other ways, not necessarily that you published open access. It's just the options on the publisher side that may make your publication more accessible.
Right. Yeah, and oftentimes the pathways, the differentiation in the pathways will reference an open access or a hybrid open access, but it's not exclusively about open access. It's just about the permissions based on the different versions of the document based on whatever the publisher's policy are.
Okay, and I want to come at this a little bit differently just so we kind of fully answer this question. If someone doesn't, if they publish not open access with a publisher that is completely behind a paywall, what does the IR do with their manuscript or with that publisher version?
In those instances, we would ask for the accepted version, and we would embargo it at least 12 months. So when submitting something to the repository, because we are mandated by the PAR plan and the OSTP memo to have all of NOAA's funded and published research available to the public. In those instances, we would ask for the accepted version, so that version that is before formatting, but after peer review, and it would be embargoed for 12 months and then made available.
Great, Jen, thank you.
Yep.
Next question. Isn't it true that any paper that has only Fed employee offers can't be embargoed at all?
I want to say yes, but again, there are a lot of so it seems simple. The content itself it can't be copyright because it's all federal employees. But in many instances, what publishers have done is that the intellectual property that they're adding to the published version of something is the formatting. And like from a legal standpoint, they are saying that, it's not strictly a government publication because it was done with additions by the publisher. There was something done to it in addition to whatever the research was. So that's why there's a lot of complications, and a lot of times, because copyright law is so complex, a lot of times it takes court rulings to really disambiguate it. So the easiest thing to do in instances like that is to submit a manuscript version if there's a question, and then you're taking out whatever the publisher feels they're adding, whatever's additive on their part, so you don't even have that amount of conflict. But I think what you're saying strictly is correct. But it's, like I said, it's a complex sort of area. And we generally land on the better safe than sorry.
Yeah, Jan, I
Methodology.
think from my understanding is like if you submit a publication and the publisher's version is the one that has, their font, their logo, all of that, and that's what they'll copyright. So it's something, Lori is correct. If it's all federal employees, this information can't be copyrighted. But if they add their font, if they add all of this other stuff to the look and feel of the paper, then they can copyright that version
Right,
or
right.
embargo that version.
Right,
Okay.
which is why we're okay with taking the accepted version of it, which is just the content, it's just the research, without any of the publisher's stuff, so that they don't have any intellectual claim over it. That's the thinking behind that, I think.
Awesome. Thanks, Jan. And thank you everyone for your questions and for sticking around. If we don't have any further questions, Jan's going to go back to his last slide,
Ew.
information on it. So if
Good
you
to
want those slides, please email jan.thomas@noaa.gov. And as I said, this has been recorded and will be posted up in a short while. But if that's it, we can give everyone back about 15 minutes of their day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.